And now we're going to get into the propaganda part. Why did Oxford write it throughout the 1580s under the names Robert Greene, Thomas Lodge, and eventually Shakespeare? Our guy put everything in the social order. Nobility was virtually everything to his vision of himself. So she starts paying him.
Hey Oxfordians, it's Phoebe De Vere. On this channel, we explore the legacy of Edward De Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who wrote the works of William Shakespeare under a pen name. Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Robert Prechter, author of Oxford's Voices, What Shakespeare Wrote Before He Was Shakespeare. In this segment, we discuss Edward De Vere's role as the Elizabethan court's propagandist, including his treatments of the Robin Hood myth and Arthurian legends. Please enjoy, and for more about Bob's book, including free samples, check out oxfordsvoices.com. Hey folks, this is part 2 of my conversation with Bob Prechter, author of Oxford's Voices. In this section, we're going to focus on Edward De Vere's role as a propagandist for Queen Elizabeth's regime. Fascinating discussion. We talk about his response to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots and his accounts of battles in the Spanish Armada and so much more.
We're going to jump forward now to 1586 through 1589. I think he was especially active as a propagandist during that time. Now, we all know that the Shakespeare plays are patriotic anyway, so whenever he wrote something, he was patriotic. But I think in some of these cases, he was more so. One of the most wonderful publications that I believe he wrote came out under the name William Warner. Now, Warner's another interesting person because there's no knowledge of the guy, and you'll look him up on Wikipedia or one of these other places and find out that later on he moved to the country where he died. Well, they don't have any evidence that this guy moved anywhere. All they know is some guy with that name out in the country died on a particular date. So they look around for a name, and for all we know, maybe Oxford did know the guy and he just he borrowed his name. So you'll see all these biographies padded with information that's really not available. And so what we really have here is a completely unknown quantity. And yet, he must have been incredibly well educated because he wrote one of the most ambitious narrative poems of the entire Elizabethan era. It's called Albion's England. It came out in 12 books over the period 1586 to 1596. And I think there's a reason why he strung it out over that period of time, which we're going to get to in a second. But the whole thing fills a book, that thick on your shelf. It's just a normal sized book. But it took him a while to finish all the books because he was doing other things as well. So what does Warner do? Warner traces the entire history of the world from Noah's flood through the Trojan War over to Britain and down to the monarchy of Queen Elizabeth. So he's putting her at the pinnacle or at the end of history at that moment and showing how the whole thing flowed naturally to give us Queen Elizabeth. So obviously she would have just blushed over this portrayal. Now, the DNB tells us the work's popularity was largely due to the author's patriotic aims and sentiment. But that's also true of Shakespeare's plays. It's true of Robert Greene's plays. It's true of George Peele's plays, all history plays that I believe that Oxford wrote. So this is in the same mold. We're on his playing field here already. Now, this is interesting too. A 19th century scholar wrote the following comment. His contemporaries ranked him on a level with Spenser and called them the Homer and Virgil of their age. But, he says, Warner rather resembled Ovid, whose metamorphosis he seems to have taken for his model. So now you can see, okay, there's another tie into the stuff we were just talking about earlier, all this Ovid stuff, and suddenly that's the model for Warner's big opus. It's becoming obvious we're dealing with another voice. Mm-hmm. The author of this poem had access to official state records. I don't know how the country gent would have got a hold of him, but Oxford certainly could get his hands on anything he wanted in that area, from William Cecil, if nobody else. Rima Greenhill's been writing about English-Russian relations and how they show up in Love's Labour's Lost. And there's a whole section, I think it's book 11, where this author covers English-Russian diplomatic relations. And I was like, this is amazing. Again, how can you possibly say this guy that you can't find any evidence existed, much less went to school or anything, and wasn't part of the government, knew all this stuff? And then you get just tiny little hints, okay? These are the kind of things there's little gems that they add up. And when you write 12 of them, you go, okay, it's our guy. Warner fails to mention the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. Well, he obviously knows his history backwards and forwards. Why would he leave that out? Well, we don't necessarily know why, but we also know that Shakespeare left it out. It's probably the best known historical event of King John's reign, and it's not mentioned in Shakespeare's play, King John. And some people say, well, maybe he didn't mention it because it was a little bit embarrassing to the monarchy to have lost some of its power to the nobles. And to me, remember we talked just a minute ago about he believed in the feudal order completely. The king or queen was sovereign. That's it. He must have hated the Magna Carta.
He wasn't a fan of Robin Hood either,
he didn't like
right?
Robin Hood a bit. In fact, there's one treatment that involves Robin Hood, and he suddenly becomes of the nobility.
Robin Hood of the nobility.
Yeah, it's really funny. Now, there's more cool stuff here, though. The first 4 books were completed in the spring of 1586. I think they were conveyed to the Queen at that time, and it's taken her a few days or a few weeks to go through it. And when she closes it up, she probably said to herself, I got to keep this guy going. You know, he's only up to this part in history, and I know where he's going. He told me where it's going to end with me on my throne. I absolutely have to keep him going. He's my number one propagandist. So she starts paying him. On June 21st, Burleigh writes to Francis Walsingham to ask if he'd spoken to the Queen on Oxford's behalf. We don't know exactly what he was supposed to talk about. But 5 days later, on June 26, Oxford is granted his £1,000 a year.
Terrific.
Now, another one that you had brought up because you kind of liked, and I had overlooked it as a piece of propaganda, but it is one. But I also think it's one that shows kind of a soft side of him, and that is a play called The Misfortunes of Arthur, published in 1587, purportedly by somebody named Thomas Hughes. I think this is, first of all, an underappreciated gem. If you go out there, you'll find very few papers and articles written about it. But still, at least one scholar made the following observation. The action, meaning the action in the play, is one, but the unities of time and place are disregarded. It forms a sort of connecting link to the rule-rejecting historical plays as Shakespeare found them and left them. Why do they have to say that? Because 1587 is too early for a Shakespeare play, so they can't even begin to think, well, maybe Shakespeare actually wrote it. So they have to say, yeah, this was like a Shakespeare play that presaged Shakespeare, and so he must have learned from it. All right, so then you find out some interesting things. The title page says that Hughes's play was, quote, presented to Her Majesty by the gentlemen of Gray's Inn. And that's the Inn of Court, of course, to which Oxford was an alumnus at the time. So he had a connection to Gray's Inn, and the play gets put before Her Majesty, okay? Now, we ought to know something about Thomas Hughes. He wrote a play that was played before the Queen. He's got probably most of the law students and maybe some of the faculty involved in putting it on. It was a very big deal. How much do we know about Thomas Hughes? Well, here's a line from one of the biographers. Otherwise, he left no mark. No mark. I even object to the word otherwise. I mean, all we have is the name on a page. We don't have a report that Hughes was walking around, teaching people their parts or anything. So really, there's zero biography for this guy. It's a name on the cover. That's it. You mentioned earlier about, what are some of the philosophies that you find throughout the works. One of them is a belief in justice tempered with mercy. Now, this bugs me a little bit because I think justice means doing what's right. But when you read the voices, you realize that justice is defined as statutory law. So what he means is, okay, we need the law, but we need to show mercy sometimes. I'll give you an example. Here we are in Measure for Measure by Shakespeare, okay? And Angela, who's the bad guy, gives a law and order speech. We must not make a scarecrow of the law, setting it up to fear the birds of prey, meaning scare them, and let it keep one shape till custom make it their perch, and not their terror. The law hath not been dead, though it hath slept. Those many had not dared to do that evil if the first that did the edict infringe had answered for his deed. Angelo's ass is on the line, and the law says his head needs to be chopped off. So what does the Duke do? Contrary to the law and order speech, spares Angelo at the end of the play. I'm the sovereign. I can do what I want. Yes, I can chop your head off, but I'm going to show you mercy and let you off the hook. So we opened Hughes's play, And here's what we find. We find a character named Cador say the following to the king. It's another Law and Order speech. No worse a vice than lenity in kings. Remiss indulgence soon undoes a realm. He teaches how to sin that winks at sins, and bids offend that suffereth an offence. The only hope of leave increaseth crimes, and he that pardoneth one emboldeneth all to break the laws. And what does King Arthur say in response? Compassion is as fit for kings as wrath. So it's the exact same set, one speech followed by the other opinion. So it's not just a Shakespeare play because line after line after line sounds like Shakespeare and has a lot of his things, a lot of his expressions, but also because it's got his philosophies as well. Let's do one more quote from this play because I think this one's just as striking, if not more so. We all know Macbeth's speech in Act 5 when he says, "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more." And he's moaning and groaning because his life is crap. Well, Hughes's epilogue ends with almost the same sentiment. This breath and heat wherewith man's life is fed is but a flash or flame that shines a while, and once extinct is as it ne'er had been. I mean, these are two 3-line passages that are not only beautiful, but are saying exactly the same thing. All right, so it's a Shakespeare play. And now we're going to get into the propaganda part. Why did Oxford write it? The Misfortunes of Arthur is a tale of Britain's greatest monarch, forced against his nature to slay a usurping relative who was also a monarch due to fear of civil war. Well, just 20 days prior to the play's staging, by my dating of everything going on, some people argue it was a year later. I think they're off by a year, but it really doesn't matter. But it's a little more dramatic if it is all the same year. On February 8th, 1587, and that's by the new calendar, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed for all those reasons. And Hughes dramatizes Arthur's anguish and also the urging of his counselors that he do the deed. And then he's pacing and trying to figure out what to do. And finally he capitulates and concludes he has no choice. And the whole scene completely parallels what historians have told us about Queen Elizabeth worrying, I don't want to do this. And they finally convince her she doesn't have a choice, and she does it. Well, I think Oxford wrote Hughes's play immediately after February 8th, the execution, and had it performed 20 days later on February 28th. 2 weeks to write it, and then another week to stage it, and there you go. And it is propaganda because the goal was to get audiences to sympathize, not with Mary, who's dead, but with Elizabeth. I bet she cried her eyes out when she saw it.
Incredible.
Yeah, and it's beautiful too.
Yeah, I love that one.
Isn't it so cool that if you understand what's going on with Oxford's voices, you would now see this play if somebody would put it on in a completely different light. If I were going to put this play on, I'd have the Queen and all of her key people, as part of it, but in the front row, as if they're watching the play. All right, so we got one more propagandist to talk about. This is another fun one. It's a little more pedestrian, but it kind of leads us into interesting places. And his name is James Lee, L-E-A. And in 1589, out comes a booklet called An Answer to the Untruths, published and printed in Spain. Well, we know it was not published and printed in Spain. It wasn't translated from Spanish. Why? Because historians found drafts of the prose portion of this thing in Lord Burleigh's handwriting. So it's a propaganda piece, absolutely from the get-go. Question is, who wrote it? Well, the pamphlet was registered on February 1st, 1589. On the very same day, Robert Greene registered the Spanish Mascarado, which covers the same topic. So I think Oxford was involved in both of them. He just took them to printer on the same day. Much of the pamphlet, as we find out, some of it's in prose, but much of it is in verse. And Burleigh did not write verse, or at least no good verse. Now, the title page also says the report was first written in Spanish and it's been translated. And guess what? This links us back to our earlier discussion. Some of those deformed child or strange sight pamphlets also have on the front, they have claimed to be translated from foreign reports. So you got the little trick, the little thread of the same trick going through these. Lee's book you would think if it was an eyewitness from the Spanish Navy or something, would tell us something about the naval battle. But he tells us absolutely nothing. Why is that? Because Oxford and Burleigh, they weren't on the sea, so they had to make it up as they went along. Battle historians tell us that John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher had crucial roles in the victory. Neither one of them is mentioned. Now, why would you write a history of England beating the Spanish Armada and not include two of its biggest heroes? Because the focus is on nobility. Lee praises 9 people in order of their military or social rank. He's got the Queen, he's got the Lord High Admiral, the Earl of Oxford, the Earl of Northumberland, the Earl of Cumberland, Lord Thomas Howard, Lord Henry Seymour, Sir Charles Blount, and Sir Francis Drake. Now, Drake was a real hero. He led the Navy, but he's put last. And this is because our guy put everything in the social order. Nobility was virtually everything to his vision of himself. And he put himself in this hierarchy, and he said, everybody else maybe gets a mention, but if they're not part of the nobility, we're not putting them in here. I think that's a flaw, but it also fits what we know about him. So the poet, singles out 8 heroes for full stanzas. He's going to tell us how wonderful each of these 8 people are. 5 of them are directly tied to the Earl of Oxford or his voices. So let's just talk about who they are. We got George Clifford. He's the 3rd Earl of Cumberland. Well, Robert Greene dedicates Pandasto to him the year before, and Greene's mourning garment to him the year after. So, he's tight with George Clifford. Lord Thomas Howard is Oxford's first cousin once removed. Now listen to what Lee writes about him, okay? This is supposed to be about battling and a war. From his honored face, the trickling tears drop down, so amber, sweet, that fair Eliza, viewing of his will, avowed, my Howard will be faithful still.
It's like Oliver Stone or something.
I felt like Oliver Stone or something.
Thomas's father and grandfather had been executed for treason. His brother Philip was at that very time imprisoned in the Tower on the same charge. So Oxford's saying, I got to save one of my dang cousins. So he's trying to, say he was a big patriot, Elizabeth. Look at this. He was crying about it. He's so loyal. And then you got to ask yourself, what historian would write about somebody's trickling tears? But I know you've heard the phrase because it appears twice in poems that we know were written by the Earl of Oxford, the E of Ox or whatever at the end of them, in A Paradise of Dainty Devices from 1576. So, all right, the third of these people he was tight with was Sir Charles Blount, and the year before, Robert Greene dedicated Alcida to him, and Thomas Nash dedicated Anatomy of Absurdity, his first book, to him. So his voices are tight with this guy as well. Then there's Charles Howard, the Lord High Admiral of England. He was known to have been Oxford's friend. He was also the first cousin of Oxford's poetic uncle, the Earl of Surrey. And Charles Howard and the Earl of Oxford fought together in a royal tournament in 1571. And get this is a direct quote from a scholar. From 1576 to 1603, Howard was patron of a playing company, Nottingham's Men, later called the Admiral's Men. The troupe performed plays by Robert Greene and Thomas Lodge's The Wounds of Civil War, and plays with, quote, titles afterward borne by Shakespeare's plays. And they can't say Shakespeare's plays because some of them they did before. They think Shakespeare wrote anything. They're Shakespeare. So obviously this guy's putting on plays that Oxford's churning out throughout the 1580s under the names Robert Greene, Thomas Lodge, and eventually Shakespeare. So he's tight with Oxford. Well, who's the 5th guy that gets praise to the skies? It's the Earl of Oxford himself, right? And this is a really well-known passage, but nobody knows that Oxford wrote it about himself. De Vere, whose fame and loyalty hath pierced the Tuscan clime, because he went to Italy, and through the Belgic lands by winged fame for valor is rehearsed. Like warlike Mars upon the hatches stands his tusked borg and foam for inward ire, while Pallas did fill his breast with warlike fire. People have argued for a long time about whether he was actually, out there in the battle. I'm 100% convinced he was not. I think he was there for a day or two, and that's on the record that he was at Tilbury for a day or two, and he spoke to Earl of Leicester there. Well, Leicester's letter to Walsingham of July 28, 1588, states that Oxford's companion for the previous day, July 27th, was somebody named Captain Huntley. Well, Captain Huntley was a captain. I think Oxford boarded Huntley's boat, probably made a speech to all the sailors on board, and he probably did it standing on a hatch. So I don't think the poem is a lie. It just implies a little more, heroics than actually occurred. And Burleigh's writing the prose portion, right? He says about Oxford that he repaired to the sea coast. He doesn't say he went to sea. It says he went to the coast to serve in the Queen's army. He originally wrote Navy, he crossed it out, put Army. And that is kind of accurate because Oxford for 48 hours or so was briefly associated with the army under Leicester's command at Tilbury. They're walking a fine line, puffing up the nobility, and this is one of his goals in life. The propaganda piece was about how great England is because of its feudal order and all the people at the top. So it's a funny kind of propaganda. It's not only for the country, but also kind of for himself.
For himself, yeah.
And Phoebe, I know that you know a lot about this, probably have a better memory for it than I do. But in 1589, Oxford was very active, writing pamphlets defending the Anglican Church against Martin Marprelate. And he had, in this case, he was using pseudonyms. He had Pascal, Marforius, and Double V, I think was one of them. And so he continued his patriotic writings. But after the 1580s were over, he didn't do nearly as much of that kind of writing. I think he really is, in the 90s is when he graduated into some of his best work.
Exciting. All right. So should we leave it there with the propaganda voices?
That pretty much covers it.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and follow me on TikTok as Phoebe De Vere. For more on Bob's work, visit oxfordsvoices.com or follow Oxford's Voices on YouTube.